Right, for more on our discussion there on the cost of living in South Africa, I'm joined now by Bosa leader, that's Mmusi Maimane, Build One South Africa. SACP's Dr. Alex Mashilo will join shortly. We also have the project manager at Alternative Information and Development Center, Dominic Brown. Gentlemen, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. Mmusi Maimane, this, for me, of course, comes from your little post that you posted on this question of liberation politics and why it is time to actually stop talking about the politics of the past. And I put that and juxtapose it to the fact that there are some urgent needs that we need to be dealing with, like the cost of living. Why are liberators unable to cushion us from this hike in the cost of living?
Yeah. Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. No one can deny the fact that we've got a government now that has mismanaged the economy. South Africa is facing profound levels of inflation, much of it driven by input costs. And those input costs are high energy costs as a start. So you can't deny the fact that the government's mismanagement of Eskom has contributed significantly to this. A fairly weakened currency, in terms of the purchase of the local currency. So you've got now an exchange rate that's increasing. Thirdly, you've got high levels of unemployment. You've got too many people living below the upper poverty line. And ultimately, high levels of corruption. And those are features, if you study liberation movements across the continent, it becomes common cause that at first, you liberate citizens, and then what happens next is either one of two things happen, either an oppressor, or you fail to, in fact, the governance test. And so that's why I fundamentally believe that to be able to fight many of the ills that are economic by nature, such as the cost of living, we have to be able to bring on a government that will focus on dealing actually with some of the economic challenges and some of the input costs I've highlighted, but also ensuring that there's a job in every home. And therefore, I don't believe that parties in fact, liberation politics often deliver that. It's clear in Zimbabwe, it's clear in multiple parts of the continent. We can use one case study. If we look at Zambia as a good example, under the entire leadership of Edgar Lungu and so many others, you saw high inflation begin to rise up. You saw actually the cost of living increase until now you've got a new government that's been led by Hakainde Hichilema. And the net consequence of it in some ways has been the strengthening of the kwacha and a sense upon which citizens feel they can participate in the economy and make a meaningful contribution. South Africa needs this change, or we are going to continue to spiral down this track.
Yeah. Dr. Alex, can you hear us? Good evening. Dr. Alex, can you hear us there? Good evening. All right, I don't think he can hear us. All right, let's go to Dominic. Dominic, let's bring you in here. I mean, we are seeking solutions to the cost of living challenge. What does liberation mean if you can't really afford to live in a liberated South Africa?
Yeah, it's true. Making ends meet is impossible for the majority of people in this country, and it's driving people into more levels of debt. And I mean, when we look at the levels of inequality in post-apartheid South Africa, they've gotten worse. And I think it's a startling fact that more than half the country lives on an income of less than 1,500 Rand per month. This is shocking when you hear reports from the Pietermaritzburg Economic and Justice and Dignity Group in terms of what would be required to live at least a bare minimum level of subsistence. And of course, if you have this deep socioeconomic crisis, which is driven by mass structural unemployment, most people are unable to live a decent life. And I think this puts to bed the notion that post-South Africa, we have seen a greater integration of people into the economy. And of course, I think Mr. Maimane is correct to say that at the root of this is the way in which the economy is structured. And unless you're able to change the economy to meet the needs of the majority of people, including through increased taxation on the wealthy and the rich, to redistribute that to the majority of people who are excluded from the country, from the economy at the moment.
And does that, Mmusi, mean we need to change our politics? I mean, I want to bring in SACP here. They'll tell you about the imperialist outlook that we have towards our approach to the economy. And theirs is to say we've got to be fighting against that colonial power that continues to control a large part of how we conduct our economy in the country.
Yeah. Look, I mean, part of the big dilemma is the fact that we haven't yet had accountability in government from the perspective of citizens being able to ask basic questions such as, at the end of the money, is there still more month left? Or at the end of the month, do I still have more money left? I guess is part of the way of looking at economics at a very personal level. The current government wants to boast the fact that it's put so many citizens on welfare, but it's a weird statistic, because whilst I think welfare is important, it doesn't help that you keep increasing the number of people on welfare not being able to deliver jobs. And much of it is in fact the idea that citizens ought to be dependent on the state. And as the Harvard report indicates, or on growth through inclusion, is the fact that the ANC government believes that the state is the only tool for development. So naturally, it has this godlike complex of believing that all matters must be under state control, and more than anything, that it should determine ultimately all the trajectory of your economy, noting many of the ills I've highlighted. What we have to do, we have to free, I take what the Kenyan says. At first, we must be liberated, and then we must liberate ourselves from the liberators. And part of that is about freeing our economy so that more people can participate. We can see a pathway for people to move out of poverty, and ultimately ensure that even on matters such as the relationship between employer and employee, that the kind of money that people get paid is such that we talk about a living wage rather than, in fact, some parties who are already wanting to call for the scrapping of the minimum wage, which is something we could certainly not endorse given the high levels of inequality in this country.
Back with you tonight here on In Focus. Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane, SACP spokesperson Dr. Alex Mashilo, and the project manager at Alternative Information and Development Center, Dominic Brown. Dr. Alex, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. What is the use of prancing about and campaigning with liberation struggle veterans when the situation on the ground in South Africa is that South Africans can't afford electricity, transport, can't afford food? Why boast about the liberation credentials if you can't be able to deliver those basic goods to the people?
Thank you, and greetings to the panelists. Firstly, we must appreciate where we come from. I attended my school under the apartheid era. We didn't have household electricity connection. The house in which I lived was just next to a gravel road. The only third road was from one major city to another. No water, nothing. Nothing at all. Our school never had electricity. Okay. After 1994, the house in which I lived is connected to electricity. The road I spoke about is now tarred. Every house in the village is called Ramokwerane, is connected to electricity. And every street where I live in Mamelodi is connected to electricity. I think we need to appreciate where we come from in order to see the difference, all right? So there are changes that have happened. Now, let us deal with the question that you have just posed. Dominic has highlighted some of the difficulties that are on the ground. If you look at government policies such as VAT zero rating, the 19 food items that fall under that category, the agricultural production inputs that fall under that category, that policy intervention has provided a cushion. Imagine if that policy intervention was not there. We can talk as we like about social grants, but the over 17 million South Africans that receive social grants are living a different life compared to when, for example, they may not be having these social grants.
Yeah.
Think about the 5 million students who received funding from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme since it was put in place.
Yeah.
And think about the cost of living, including of education that they would have faced,
Right.
had it not been of that intervention.
Yeah, but Dr. Alex, one can say, well, cataloging historical facts, primarily great, showing us where we come from. Now we have new roads, and we are able to have new schools and so on and so forth. But it doesn't appear to be dealing with the new challenges that we are dealing with now. We can recount the historical facts great and well. We need to know them, but it's not coming up with the new solutions that we need to deal with in the new challenges.
No. I like the way you phrased your assertion. You said it doesn't appear. I put to you that the over 5 million students who received funding from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme would have been excluded from education had it not been of that intervention. And by the way, we are not talking here only about tuition. You go to these colleges and universities, these students receive almost all the major interventions they live on from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. So these are historical facts. And we are not talking here about history as something that has passed. We are talking about the present continuous history. There are people who are receiving these benefits. And this does not mean that we have arrived to a South Africa that we needed. For example, we can speak as we would like to do, but if I may just highlight the following facts. South Africa is an oil import dependent country. We do not produce our own oil. Oil is a key input in agricultural production, in transportation, in almost all major categories of production. I'm not talking politics here, I'm talking realities. So if international oil prices increase and diesel prices increase, petrol prices increase, that finds its expression in our cost of living through the pricing mechanism. So you can speak like, let's say, for example, an opposition leader. But these are the realities that we face. So the question is, how do we deal with these realities? I mentioned earlier the VAT zero-rated items. You will know that one of the interventions is that when coming to fuels that are subject to the fuel levy, those items are zero-rated. You're talking about paraffin, you're talking about petrol, you're talking about diesel, as long as they are under the category of the fuel levy. So there are interventions, but at the same time, there are difficulties. Let me summarize my point here.
Yeah. Before you summarize, hold on.
Can I just summarize the point?
I wanted Dominic to jump in, and then I'll give you a chance to summarize. I don't want you to close it too quickly. Dominic, you wanted to come in there before you forget what you want to say.
No, I think Dr. Mashilo makes important points. For example, improved connections of electricity, and I mean, if you look from 1994 till now, 90% electrification. But I think what Dr. Mashilo doesn't account for is that a lot of the steps forward has been eroded over the past 15, 20 years due to, unfortunately, Mr. Maimane's prognosis of the current crisis, which is to have a more freer economy. And moving towards a more freer economy in South Africa, entrenched within a neoliberal economic paradigm, has in fact, for example, meant we adopted a full cost recovery model for electricity prices. And so despite the fact that you have 90% electrification, most people cut themselves off from electricity because they can't afford to pay for it. And this is not even to talk about the tens of thousands of people in Emalahleni and in Mpumalanga more generally who don't have electrification at all. So I think we must talk to those issues. I think we need to talk to how the fact that the fiscal consolidation or the budget cuts over the past 10 years, which has increased into a harsh austerity agenda over the past 5 years, including the cuts to the public sector wage bill, which is part of being part of a freer economy, and renouncing the state's role as a need for a developmental player within the economy. And the less the role of the state becomes, and you have it open it up to the private sector, the main motive is profit maximization.
Right.
And if you have a country that has most people unemployed and has most people who are unable to make their basic ends meet, the profit maximization motive for the delivery of essential services won't work.
Right.
Now, this is coupled, unfortunately, with the idea that post-1994, that we needed to create a black bourgeoisie, a patriotic bourgeoisie. And this has been a core principle of the ANC policy over the past 25 or 30 years. And this is in part why we see the black majority excluded from the economy. And this is where the corruption is actually created from. So unless you move away from an economy that's dependent on the free market, and unless you get away with this idea that you need to create a new black capitalist class, and instead you use the state as a means to discipline the private sector, for example, how much profits the major supermarket retailers get from big prices that most people are dependent on. That could be a way of curbing the price.
All right.
Of
Dominic, let's hear Mmusi Maimane on that very quickly because I'm going to run out of time. Discipline the private sector. Yes, I will, and I'll give you a chance to wrap up. Discipline the private sector, Mmusi Maimane. I'm sure it's not words that you would like to hear as Build One South Africa.
No. But I think it's important that we recognize that development is both a function of public and private sector. I think that anyone who thinks that the growth of an economy is merely dependent on either the state or the markets has missed out on global trends on this particular issue. I think that what we've got to be doing is rather being an enabling partner. The state has failed at building appropriate infrastructure for citizens, regardless of where they are, to be able to bring out the developmental components that we're describing. I just want to reflect on Dr. Mashilo's key points, salient points, which is South Africa is better than under apartheid, which is the broader meta-narrative that the current government wants to posit. And at one level, sure, no one is debating that. But surely the benchmark cannot be apartheid relative to the fact that countries that started on the same trajectory, if you were to take from 94 and you look at countries who are at the same GDP levels as they are, you can't deny the fact that they've outstripped us. And outstripped us by a number of key indicators. The reality of it is that 2 out of 3 young people cannot find jobs in this country. And sure, you might make the claim to say many of them have, some of them are on NSFAS, etc. But the other harsh reality is that when you put those young people on TVET colleges, the throughput rate there sits at just over 10%. So it indicates the fact that we're now living in a country where in many ways, despite all the gains of the first 15 years, and I must give credit that post-94 we started. Of course, we electrified more houses. Of course, we built more houses than there were shacks. But you can't deny the eroding of what happened in the last 15 years with the eroding of the state capability, even if you believe fundamentally in the ability of the state to be as a tool for development. It's been eroded. You can't deny the inflationary burden that's been brought upon by corruption, where even the building of a school, I went to a school recently, spent for hundreds of millions of rands And yet, in fact, it's built on marshland. It's now dysfunctional. All of that money is wasted. That is an additional tax to the fiscus. And that's been fundamentally to the point that Dominic makes, which is an elite class who have captured the state and successfully managed to use it for its own patronage model. So I really do think we must look at South Africa as a game of two halves. The first 15 years, and let's not dare undermine the fact that the last 15 years have really been a better life for some at the expense of the majority of citizens in this country.
All right, Dr. Alex, there you go. Now I'll give you a chance. You can respond to both. Steps that have been taken that have brutally eroded the very same gains that you say we have made.
No, Tabi, so there is still the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. As I talk to you tonight, there are students who are receiving it and who will receive it tomorrow. It is still there. The household electrification that has extended. By the way, we come from a history where since the first household electrification in Cape Town in 1894 to 1994, the oppressed African majority were excluded. I do hear what Mr. Maimane is saying, but here in Africa, South Africa is the only country that achieved its transition in 1994. There was no other after South Africa. So I don't know which countries is he comparing South Africa with when he said those countries come from the same base with us and have overtaken us. We can look at Asia, we can look at Latin America, we can look at Europe. I am more interested here on the African continent. The youngest country here is South Sudan as a result of the division of Sudan, right? It cannot be a matter of fact that there are countries we started with and these countries have overtaken us. That is just, I think Mr. Maimane has aired there. We just need to base our assertions on data, right? And by the way, when Dominic came in, you stopped me saying, I want to summarize my point. And Dominic spoke about the rolling back of some of the achievements we have made in 1994. And Mr. Maimane makes an addition to that. I was going to come and make an important point in that particular regard. You see, the principal contradiction of the South African economy is the capitalist system, Mr. Maimane. In the capitalist system, labor creates value, which is turned into wealth. And this value that is created by labor receives nothing from it except the cost of production called wages, just like all other costs of production. The ultimate produce of production called profit, 100% of it goes to the capitalist class. That's the fundamental in terms of where we stand. That's the principal contradiction you need to confront. Dominic touched at it on the surface level when he referred to your prognosis. And I'm sure he knows that I would be agreeing with him. But to agree with him, we need to go to the root of the matter. I'm telling you, I'm just a few kilometers away from Pick and Pay, where a worker I know was earning less than 3,500 a month. These interventions you say are not there came about when the largest federation in this country, COSATU, fought for a national minimum wage. This has improved the lives of the workers who would not have seen any wage increases had it not been of the ANC-led government that implemented the national minimum wage. There is no doubt that corruption has impacted on our capacity to move forward. But the starting point of corruption is the robbery, is the fundamental robbery that occurs in the economy.
Yeah.
The robbery that involves workers producing wealth, and this wealth produced by labor, appropriated by a few individuals, calling it their private property. And we come here and say the masses are poor. This is the fundamental problem we must confront.
Dr. Alex, I'm going to have to push you for time. I'm completely out. But in 30 seconds, quickly wrap what your thoughts are.
Yeah, just in 30 seconds, we need to change the distribution mechanism in the economy. because the fact that a tiny minority of individuals takes everything from the economy after all costs of production have been paid not only causes unemployment, poverty, and drives inequality, but also deprives the state of the resources we need for development. This is the point that Dominic made at the surface level. I am entrenching it. We need an intervention to change the distributive mechanism so that we can level the playing field and advance forward. And in conclusion, I want to agree we need to deal with corruption decisively.
Let's leave it there. Much appreciated. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming on. Mmusi Maimane, Dr. Alex Mashilo, and Dominic Brown. We're back in a moment.